What if I told you their greatest fear wasn't that you'd fight back, but that you'd stop needing their validation altogether? They came with charm. They came with smiles. They came with the carefully calculated warmth that melts most people's defenses. But it didn't work on you. You felt something. A quiet discomfort behind the flattery. A shadow in their compliments. A strange silence between their words. And while others leaned in, you took a step back. You saw something they didn't want seen. You heard what wasn't spoken. You recognized the manipulation before it even had a name. And that's when the real war began. Let me be clear. You were never supposed to rise. Not in their story. You were the one meant to be controlled, grateful, small. They had the script. They had the game. And they thought they had you figured out. But something sacred stirred within you. Not pride. Not rebellion. Discernment. A gift from God Himself, the ability to sense deception, even when it's wrapped in velvet. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And you did. You guarded your heart even when they called you cold. You trusted your spirit even when they called you paranoid. You refused to play along, and for that, they declared you the villain. They couldn't break you. So now they fear you. When you didn't fall into their charm trap, they grew frustrated. Why weren't you like the others? Why didn't you cling to their approval? Why weren't you flattered by their attention? They tried harder. More praise. More games. More manipulation dressed as love. But the more they pushed, the more you withdrew, not in weakness, but in spiritual strategy. They couldn't handle the quiet power of someone who doesn't need to be seen to know their worth. So they moved to phase 2, gaslighting. You're too sensitive. You misunderstood. You always assume the worst. But you knew what you felt. Your spirit wouldn't be swayed by rehearsed apologies or twisted logic. You didn't just hear their words, you felt their frequency. And something in your bones said, "This is not of God." This wasn't just a personality clash. This wasn't just bad behavior. This was spiritual warfare. Ephesians 6:12 reminds us, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers." What you felt wasn't imagined, it was designed. A strategy from unseen forces to compromise your divine assignment. But what they didn't account for was your armor. You didn't even know you were equipped until the attacks came. And when they did, your discernment sharpened. Your boundaries solidified. Your inner radar screamed louder. They wanted to conquer you. But instead, they woke you up. In the book of Nehemiah, when the wall of Jerusalem was being rebuilt, enemies came. They mocked. They schemed. They tried to distract the workers from their divine mission. But Nehemiah's reply was legendary. "I am doing a great work and I cannot come down." Nehemiah 6:3. You said the same, not with words, but with actions. You refused to engage in their drama. You stayed on your wall. You kept building even as they threw stones from below. And it drove them mad. Let's talk about your design. You weren't made for people-pleasing. You weren't made to live in cycles of guilt and appeasement. You weren't made to bend for those who manipulate. You were made for something higher. Your soul was encoded with filters, spiritual algorithms that detect falsehood, even when everyone else is fooled. And when that system activates, no amount of sweet talk can override it. No manipulation tactic can deceive it. It's like your entire being goes on alert. Not in fear but in wisdom. It's God's way of saying, "My child, I place something in you the enemy can't touch. Trust it." So now, they're furious. Not because you harmed them, but because you exposed them. Not by shouting, but by seeing. Not by fighting, but by standing still. Not by arguing, but by not needing their validation. You're the mirror they couldn't shatter. And every time you say no with calm clarity, every time you don't react, every time you grow in silence, you remind them of what they tried to bury. That they never had control. That their power was performance. That their dominance was never real. And now, their fury is not a sign of your failure. It's proof of your freedom. Let's end this part with a sacred truth. You were never made to be conquered. You were made to be called. You were made to see. And when your vision expanded, their illusion collapsed. Let them be furious. Let them rage. Because while they burn with frustration, you rise with purpose. You walk with clarity. You breathe in peace they'll never understand. And that is power. They smiled while setting the trap. They laughed while spinning the web. But when you walked away untouched, their true face surfaced. They thought it would work. The games. The gaslighting. The veiled insults coded in concern. The cycle of rejection and reward, hope and harm. They expected you to collapse under the weight of confusion. But something happened that shattered their confidence. You stopped needing answers and started trusting your intuition. They couldn't handle that. So the charm dropped, and the rage came rushing in. At first, they played sweet. They cloaked their criticism in concern. "I just want what's best for you. You're too emotional, you always overreact. I'm saying this out of love." But when those tactics no longer silenced you, when your boundaries stood like fortified walls, when their words could no longer pierce your confidence, they grew cold, then cruel, then calculated. What they once offered as connection, they now are replaced with covert warfare. And what's terrifying is this: they don't explode suddenly. They erode slowly. It begins with little digs at your identity. Jokes that aren't funny. Critiques masked as advice. Praise withheld unless you conform. They plant doubt like seeds. They water it with isolation. They harvest control when your roots grow in confusion. This isn't just about flawed people, it's about a pattern used by dark spiritual forces throughout time. And the Bible gives us many examples. Let's break down the tactics they used on you and why they failed. 1. Gaslighting your reality. They made you question your memory, your perception, even your worth. "No one else has a problem with me. That never happened. You're being dramatic." But your spirit refused to forget what your heart felt. 2. Withholding affection as punishment. When you didn't comply, They withdrew. Love became a reward system. They trained others like pets, but you walked away hungry, but free. 3. Isolation as control. They pulled you away from anyone who might affirm your truth. They became your only source of validation. But you chose solitude over slavery. Let's remember Samson and Delilah. Delilah didn't strike Samson with a sword, she seduced him with questions. She drained his strength not with power but with persistence. Judges 16:16 says, "With such nagging she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it." That's exactly how these spirits operate. Not always loud, but endlessly draining. They wear you down with cycles of confusion, not fire. They don't fight you with war, they use whispers. But unlike Samson, you didn't give up your secret. You didn't trade your strength for false peace. You held the line, and for that, the enemy lost access. The more they pushed, the clearer your instincts became. What once sounded like kindness began to sound like control. What once felt like love started to feel like possession. And your spiritual immune system kicked in. Conversations left you drained. Time with them felt like walking on invisible glass. Your peace disappeared after every encounter. But this discomfort was your divine training ground. You weren't being punished, you were being refined. Now the rage makes sense, doesn't it? Because you escaped. And not just physically, you escaped energetically. You reclaimed your time, your voice, your light. And now, they're exposed. Because what they feared most wasn't your anger. It was your clarity. The moment you saw through them, they knew the game was over. So they escalated. Smear campaigns, sudden guilt trips, bizarre shifts between rage and fake remorse. It's a panic pattern. Their tactics failed. Their control collapsed. So now, they swing wildly, hoping you'll come back even if it's through conflict. Let's be clear. Your quiet defiance stirred a spiritual hornet's nest. Not because you were wrong, but because you were finally right. 2 Timothy 3:13 speaks clearly. Evil men and impostors will go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. Their tactics didn't just deceive you. They deceived themselves into thinking you'd always stay. But the truth set you free. And freedom feels like betrayal to those who loved your captivity. You were never meant to stay in a maze of confusion. You were born for clarity. You were destined for spiritual sight. So now, let them rage. Let them write their stories. Let them gasp for control. Because you're breathing freely now. They searched for your weakness, but found a fortress. Because what shields you wasn't built overnight, it was woven into your soul by God Himself. They thought your strength was a performance. They assumed your silence was strategy. They believed they could manipulate you because it worked on everyone else. But you weren't reacting. You were protected. Not by logic, not by ego, but by design. Long before you faced them, heaven had already prepared you. Let's be real, you didn't become strong overnight. Your resilience didn't come from motivation quotes or social media therapy. It came from scars. From nights you cried out and heard nothing but kept walking. From moments you were misunderstood, misjudged, mislabeled but didn't collapse. The protection you carry now. It's not armor made by man, it's divine engineering. Woven into your DNA are codes that detect spiritual danger. And when manipulation walked into the room, your system lit up like a silent alarm. Others heard sweet words. You heard static. Others saw a smile. You saw the serpent beneath it. This isn't just intuition. This is a sacred algorithm designed by your Creator. Your nervous system responds to deception before your mind can explain it. Your heart rejects falsehood even when your brain wants to give them a second chance. Your very energy field knows when something or someone is not of God. Psalm 139:14 declares, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Yes, even your ability to see through darkness, that's part of the wonderful design. You were not made to follow the blind. You were made to recognize truth even when it's unpopular. You were made to break generational patterns even if it meant walking alone. They tried to get in. They tried to rewrite your story, to rewire your beliefs, to reduce your light. But something sacred inside of you refused to open. A chamber, a spiritual sanctuary, a sealed place that only God has access to. While the rest of you wrestled with confusion, that part stayed holy. It preserved your essence. It whispered, you were not made for this. And even when you almost forgot who you were, that sanctuary remembered. That's why you never fully broke. That's why you never surrendered completely. That's why, despite their best efforts, you still knew. The story of Job is often seen as suffering, but hidden in the opening chapters is a divine secret. In Job 1:10, Satan complains to God, saying, have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? That's right. Even the enemy admitted. Job was protected. Not by wealth. Not by influence. But by something invisible. A hedge of divine insulation. You have that too. Every chosen one does. And when darkness tries to breach it, the hedge fights back. That's why their tactics fell flat. That's why their charm collapsed. That's why their words didn't poison you completely. Because God in His mercy placed a barrier around your purpose. They searched for your weak points. Past wounds. Old traumas. Hidden insecurities. They pressed every button. But the response they wanted never came. Because you were learning. You no longer allowed the past to be a doorway. You no longer accepted shame as truth. You no longer mistook trauma for loyalty. And every time you didn't react, they panicked. Because silence from someone they couldn't conquer is louder than any scream. Let's talk science for a moment. The renewal of the mind. Romans 12:2 tells us, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You've been through that transformation. Your thoughts shifted. Your self-talk changed. Your identity matured. What once would have triggered anxiety now triggers discernment. What once would have led to chasing people now leads to chasing purpose. You didn't just protect your mind. You reprogrammed it. And that's a level of power manipulation can't penetrate. They thought this was psychological. They thought they could break you with their strategies. But this was never about mental toughness. It was about spiritual architecture. God didn't just place favor on you. He wove strength into you. The problem? They only studied your actions, not your source. They calculated your reactions but missed your anointing. They never expected you to be this grounded, this healed, this clear. They thought you'd collapse under pressure. Instead, you were pressurized into power. Let this sink in. You were protected, not by luck, not by fear, but by eternal design. And now that you've remembered who you are, no tactic, no threat, no voice of guilt can shake you again. You don't have to defend it. You just have to walk in it. Because you were built by God, and the blueprint has no weak points. They wanted control but triggered transformation. They came to silence you but instead awakened a voice that can't be ignored. They thought the pressure would break you, that the lies, confusion, isolation would shatter your will. But instead, the attack became your awakening. Because chosen ones don't die in darkness. They awaken in it. It wasn't one moment. It was hundreds. A quiet shift in how you saw the world, how you saw them, how you saw yourself. You no longer begged for clarity. You claimed it. The games didn't work anymore. The guilt stopped sticking. The silence stopped hurting. Why? Because the fog lifted. The veil tore. And for the first time, you saw the spirit behind the smile. Each word meant to cut sharpened your discernment. Each rejection fortified your self-respect. Each lie drove you deeper into truth. You stopped explaining yourself. You started observing. You stopped reacting. You started remembering. The battle didn't crush you, it called you. It activated gifts you didn't know you had. Spiritual intuition, psychic clarity, emotional mastery, energetic protection. And they noticed. They felt the shift. And it terrified them. Joseph's brothers threw him into a pit out of jealousy. Thought they ended his story. But in that darkness, Joseph's destiny began. Genesis 50:20 tells us, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." They wanted your destruction, but God used it as a doorway. You didn't just survive their pit. You came out with a prophetic gift. After the break, came the messages. Dreams that revealed truths. Random conversations that confirmed your doubts. Scriptures that jumped off the page. Repeating numbers and signs you couldn't ignore. The universe, heaven, began to speak in ways louder than words. You weren't imagining it. You were finally aligned enough to hear it. And when divine guidance replaced people-pleasing, you couldn't be controlled anymore. They couldn't handle the version of you that set boundaries without explanation, said no without guilt, chose solitude without shame, trusted your vision without consensus. You stopped being available. You became unreachable to the frequency of manipulation. And suddenly, their power shrank. Your light expanded. The cage opened and you walked out. This isn't about revenge. This is about resurrection. The old you, the one who questioned your worth, over-explained, over-loved, overcompensated. That version is gone. Now you walk like someone who's seen both hell and heaven and chose holiness. You've tasted truth, and you can never untaste it again. Let this settle in your soul. The moment they lost control was the moment you came alive. Your awakening wasn't their intention, but it was God's design. And now, you see clearly. You hear differently. You move with purpose. You are no longer in survival mode. You are in assignment mode. They spent all their energy trying to bring you down. But the higher you rose, the more unstable their false kingdom became. They thought they were in control. They thought their tactics worked. They thought you were the same as the others, easy to manipulate, easy to trap. But now, they don't even recognize you. Because the version of you they tried to dominate no longer exists. Everything they built, their influence, image, control, was constructed like a house of cards, held up by fear, by fake charm, by lies polished to look like truth. But you became the wind that exposed their structure. Every time you refused to engage, every time you set a boundary, every time you chose peace instead of panic, a card fell. And now, what once looked powerful looks pitiful. You didn't have to lift a finger. Just your growth, just your clarity, just your detachment was enough to destabilize their identity. Because their ego was never strong. It only seemed strong when it stood on your confusion. And now, they're unraveling. Relationships failing. Mask slipping. Reputation cracking. Behavior turning erratic. They're trying harder, but it's only making things worse. Because what once fed them your energy is no longer available. Pharaoh ruled Egypt with fear. His power seemed absolute. Until Moses showed up, not with weapons but with God. Pharaoh's heart hardened. His kingdom resisted. But with every plague, every warning, every ignored sign, Egypt crumbled. Exodus 14:28. Not one of them survived. That's what happens when false power resists divine order. And just like Moses, you didn't retaliate with rage. You stood firm with purpose. Now, their walls are falling and you're walking free. They used to write the story. You were the problem. You were too sensitive. You were unstable. But now, your silence is louder than their lies. You no longer need to explain. You let truth reveal itself. And those who used to doubt you are starting to see it too. Because truth has its own gravity. Eventually everything falls toward it. You didn't just rise, you radiated. And they couldn't compete with that. Not because you tried to outshine them, but because authentic light doesn't need to perform. It just is. And now that you're walking in that light, their manipulation seems childish. Their rage seems desperate. Their drama looks small next to your clarity. Let this truth anchor you. You didn't destroy them. Their collapse was self-inflicted. You simply healed. You simply saw. You simply chose to grow. And when you outgrow manipulation, those who thrived on your confusion can no longer breathe. Their fall isn't your fault. It's the result of a life built on control. Confronting someone finally built on truth. They didn't just fail to destroy you, they accidentally revealed who you were always meant to be. You didn't just survive, you transformed. And now, every step you take, every truth you embody, every boundary you uphold, is evidence that their entire strategy collapsed. They lost not when you exposed them, but when you became someone they no longer had access to. Let's be clear. This wasn't easy. There were nights you almost gave up. Days you questioned if maybe they were right. Moments when the silence was louder than their lies. But you stayed the course. And because of that, you didn't just heal. You resurrected. Not back to the old you, but into someone wiser, clearer, quieter, stronger. They thought their betrayal would define your ending. Instead, it became your new beginning. The cross wasn't the end of Jesus' story. It was the pathway to glory. They mocked him. They buried him. They sealed the tomb. But 3 days later, he walked out. Not with vengeance, but with victory. And like Christ, your silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. They thought your retreat meant defeat. But God was working in the stillness, resurrecting your purpose, rebuilding your identity, revealing your anointing. What they triggered in you wasn't pain, it was power. You've learned how to recognize false peace, discern spiritual counterfeits, set non-negotiable boundaries, say no with clarity, walk away without fear. Your voice is calmer. Your presence is heavier. Your light is cleaner. They used to drain you. Now they avoid you. Because they can't manipulate what they can no longer read. They can't influence what they can't confuse. You've become spiritually invisible to their old tactics. Your survival is not just a personal victory. It's a message. Every healed part of you now shines as direction for the lost, comfort for the wounded, proof for the doubters, and a warning for the deceivers. You are living, walking, breathing proof that divine light cannot be extinguished by human schemes. They can lie about your past. They can twist your words. They can smear your name. But they can't fake your peace. And peace, real peace, speaks louder than defense. You didn't need revenge. Because what's done in the Spirit returns in the Spirit. The energy they sent out is finding its way home. Not because you cursed them, but because you released them. And now that you've let go, God can take over. Romans 12:19, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. You walk forward. God handles the rest. This chapter ends not with bitterness but with clarity. You've proven that spiritual warfare is real. Healing is holy. Boundaries are biblical. And truth always prevails. They couldn't conquer you because you were never meant to be conquered. You were meant to rise. And now, as you walk in the fullness of your rebirth, you become what they never expected. A light they can't dim. A voice they can't silence. A soul they'll never understand. This is your victory. Not by force, but by faith.